Never underestimate a woman who's been told she'll never succeed. Revenge tastes better when served with a side of irony. If you want to see how I turned my father's harsh words into the sweetest victory, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of incredible comebacks. Growing up in Portland, I always felt like I was living in my father's shadow. My name is Hazel Mitchell, and for most of my life, I was just Frank Mitchell's disappointing daughter. Dad owned Mitchell's Hardware on Main Street, a family business passed down through 3 generations. Everyone in our neighborhood knew him, the successful businessman, the community leader, the man who had it all figured out. And then there was me, the daughter who couldn't seem to do anything right in his eyes. Our house was a modest 2-story colonial in a middle-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business. Dad was practically a local celebrity, the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and what they needed for their home improvement projects. At community barbecues, people would cluster around him, hanging on his every word about the proper way to seal a deck or install crown molding. Meanwhile, I'd be in the kitchen with the other women, helping my mother prepare food that rarely received more than a passing acknowledgement. "Hazel, you need to be practical," he'd say at least once a week during my high school years. "Your head is always in the clouds. You'll never amount to anything if you keep chasing these ridiculous dreams." Those dreams he referred to? I wanted to open a restaurant. Not just any restaurant, but a place that would bring people together over amazing food and create memories. I'd spend hours in our kitchen experimenting with recipes, much to my father's annoyance. He saw cooking as a basic life skill, not a career path. My earliest memory of cooking was standing on a step stool beside my grandmother, watching her knead bread dough when I was 5 years old. The way she transformed simple ingredients into something that made the whole house smell like heaven fascinated me. By 12, I was preparing dinner for the family at least once a week. By 16, I had filled 3 notebooks with recipes and restaurant concepts. When I announced I wanted to go to culinary school instead of pursuing a business degree like he wanted, the argument that followed was explosive. Dad slammed his fist on our dining table, rattling the plates from the dinner I had prepared. A perfectly seared salmon with a lemon dill sauce that had taken me hours to perfect. "You're throwing your life away on a hobby," he shouted. "Restaurants fail all the time. You don't have what it takes to make it in that industry." His words cut deep, especially because part of me feared he might be right. The restaurant industry was notoriously difficult. I'd researched enough to know the statistics weren't in my favor. Mom tried to mediate, but she always ultimately sided with Dad. "Your father just wants what's best for you, honey," she'd say while helping me clean up the kitchen afterward. "Maybe consider taking some business classes along with your cooking courses?" My mother, Nancy Mitchell, was the peacekeeper in our family. A former elementary school teacher who gave up her career when I was born, she'd spent her life smoothing over my father's rough edges and translating his harsh words into what she claimed were well-intentioned concerns. I loved her dearly, but sometimes I wished she would stand up to him more, or stand up for me. I did end up taking those business classes, but not because my parents pressured me. I took them because I was determined to prove my father wrong. I wanted to understand every aspect of running a successful restaurant, from creating the perfect menu to managing finances and staff. The culinary program I chose was across the country in New York, as far from Portland and my father's disapproving glare as I could manage. My parents helped with tuition, which came with strings attached, weekly phone calls to report my grades and progress. These calls usually ended with Dad asking if I'd come to my senses yet about my career choice. Despite his constant doubt, I thrived in culinary school. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who shared my passion and took it seriously. My knife skills earned praise from instructors. My palate was considered exceptional. I graduated in the top 5% of my class, though my father couldn't make it to the ceremony due to an important hardware convention. The day after I graduated from culinary school, I moved to Seattle. I needed space from my father's disapproving glances and constant reminders of how I was setting myself up for failure. I started at the bottom, working as a line cook in a busy downtown restaurant. The hours were brutal, the pay was terrible, and my tiny apartment could barely fit a bed and a dresser. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the right path. That first apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up with temperamental plumbing and neighbors who fought loudly at 3 in the morning. The kitchen was barely big enough to turn around in, with a mini fridge and a 2-burner stove that tilted precariously to the left. But it was mine. And every night when I collapsed into bed with aching feet and hands that smelled permanently of garlic, I felt a sense of pride my father could never take away. Over the next 8 years, I worked my way up through some of Seattle's most respected restaurants. I learned from talented chefs, absorbed everything I could about restaurant operations, and saved every penny. My hands became calloused, my feet ached constantly, and I missed countless holidays and weekends with friends. But I was building something, both skills and a reputation. The restaurant world was just as challenging as my father had warned. I was sexually harassed by a sous chef at my second job and had to fight to be taken seriously as a woman in a male-dominated kitchen. I worked through a severe case of flu because the restaurant was short-staffed during a major food critics visit. I spent one Christmas Eve sleeping on bags of flour in the dry storage room because a snowstorm made it impossible to get home between dinner and breakfast service. Through it all, I kept those business classes in mind. I studied the restaurants where I worked, noting what made them succeed or struggle. I volunteered to help with inventory, ordering, and scheduling whenever possible, building skills beyond just cooking. On my days off, I visited farmers markets and local producers, building relationships that would prove invaluable later. I rarely went home during those years. My relationship with my father had deteriorated to obligatory phone calls on birthdays and major holidays. Each conversation was the same. He'd ask if I was still playing around in kitchens, and I'd grit my teeth and change the subject. Mom would call separately and try to smooth things over, telling me how proud she was, even if she never said it in front of Dad. She'd send care packages with homemade cookies and clippings from the local newspaper, usually highlighting some business award my father had won or charity event he'd sponsored. It seemed important to her that I stay connected to Portland, to my roots, even as I was putting down new ones in Seattle. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. I was working as a sous chef at Belltown Bistro, one of Seattle's hottest restaurants, when I met James Cooper. He was a regular customer who always requested to be seated in my section of the kitchen counter so he could watch me work. After months of chatting about food and restaurants, he revealed he was an investor looking for his next project. James was in his early 50s, a former tech executive who had made his fortune in the early days of internet startups. Unlike many wealthy patrons, he was genuinely interested in the craft of cooking, not just the status of dining at trendy restaurants. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. "I've been watching you, Hazel," he said one evening as I prepared his usual order. "You have a unique talent and vision. Have you ever thought about opening your own place?" I laughed. Only every day for the past 15 years. 2 weeks later, James and I were reviewing business plans over coffee. 6 months after that, we signed the lease on a space in Capitol Hill. With James's investment and my culinary expertise, Wildflower was born, a farm-to-table restaurant showcasing the best of Pacific Northwest ingredients. The space needed significant renovations, and I threw myself into every aspect of the design. I wanted an open kitchen where diners could see the care that went into their food. I chose reclaimed wood tables and locally crafted pottery dishes. Every detail reflected my vision, from the handwritten menus that changed daily based on what was freshest to the herb garden we planted along the back wall. The first year was terrifying. I worked 18-hour days, dealt with staffing nightmares, equipment failures, and the constant fear that my father had been right all along, that I didn't have what it takes. But slowly, Wildflower began to gain attention. A positive review in Seattle Weekly brought in curious diners. Word of mouth spread. By our second anniversary, we had a month-long waiting list for reservations. During those early days, I called my mother more frequently, needing her encouragement, even if I wouldn't admit it. She always asked if I'd told my father about the restaurant. I always changed the subject. I wanted to succeed or fail on my own terms, without his judgment hanging over me. In our third year, Food and Wine named Wildflower one of the top new restaurants in the country. The journalist who wrote the feature described my cooking as soulful yet sophisticated, with a clear point of view and extraordinary attention to detail. The day the magazine hit newsstands, I bought a copy and sent it to my parents' address with a simple note. "Thought you might want to see this." Mom called, gushing with excitement. Dad never mentioned it. That same year, I was invited to participate in a prestigious food festival in Aspen. As I was setting up my booth, a familiar voice behind me said, "Excuse me? Are you Hazel Mitchell?" I turned to find Julia Chen, the celebrated chef whose cookbook had been my Bible during culinary school. She had come specifically to try my food after reading the Food and Wine article. When she asked if I'd consider contributing to her next cookbook, I had to pinch myself to make sure I wasn't dreaming. 2 more years passed, and Wildflower continued to thrive. We expanded to a larger location, and I was approached about writing a cookbook. James and I opened a second restaurant, a casual cafe that became just as successful as our flagship. I had finally built the life I'd dreamed of, on my terms. The cookbook deal was particularly sweet. I titled it Wildflower Seasonal Cooking from the Pacific Northwest and dedicated it to everyone who believed in me, and especially to those who didn't. The publisher sent advance copies to several notable chefs and food writers. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, with pre-orders exceeding expectations. The launch party was scheduled for the following month. I was in my office reviewing vendor contracts when my phone rang. It was Mom, her voice shaking. "Hazel, I don't know how to tell you this, but your father had a mild heart attack yesterday." My blood ran cold. Despite everything, he was still my father. Is he okay?" I managed to ask. "Yes, he's stable. The doctors say he needs to take it easy, reduce stress. He's going to have to step back from the hardware store." The hardware store had been Dad's life for over 30 years. I couldn't imagine him stepping back from anything, let alone the business that had defined him. "Do you need me to come home?" I asked, already knowing the answer. No, we're fine," Mom said unconvincingly. "The doctors say he'll make a full recovery with medication and lifestyle changes." "I'm coming anyway," I said. "I'll be there tomorrow." I flew to Portland the next day. Walking into my childhood home felt strange, like stepping into a past life. Mom hugged me tightly at the door, her frame seeming smaller than I remembered. Her hair had gone completely gray since I'd last seen her, and new lines creased her face. Lines of worry I suspected had been there for some time. Dad was in his recliner in the living room, looking pale and somehow diminished. The sight of him knocked the wind out of me. This wasn't the intimidating figure who had dominated my youth. This was just an aging man who looked tired and vulnerable. "Hey, Dad," I said softly. He looked up, surprise flashing across his face. "Hazel, you didn't have to come all this way." Of course I did. The next few days were a strange dance of awkward conversations and long silences. I helped Mom with cooking and cleaning while Dad adjusted to his new medication regimen. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I overheard my parents talking in low voices in the living room. "We need to face facts, Frank," Mom was saying. "You can't run the store anymore, and we can't afford to hire a manager with what the doctor bills are going to be. What choice do we have? The business has been in my family for generations. I can't just let it go." "We could sell," Mom suggested gently. "Retire early. And then what? Who would I be if not the owner of Mitchell's Hardware?" I stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, a wooden spoon dripping sauce onto the floor. My parents were in financial trouble, and they hadn't said a word to me about it. More than that, my father's entire identity was wrapped up in that store, just as mine was in my restaurants. For the first time, I recognized something of myself in him, and it was an uncomfortable realization. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father's pride, about our strained relationship, and about the success I'd built despite his lack of faith in me. And then a crazy idea began to form. The next morning, I made some calls. First to James, then to my executive chef at Wildflower, and finally to a real estate agent in Portland. By the time I joined my parents for breakfast, I had made a decision that would change all of our lives. "I'm going to stay in Portland for a while," I announced, pouring coffee for the three of us. "Don't be ridiculous," Dad said immediately. "You have your restaurants to run. I have excellent staff who can handle things. Besides, I've been thinking about expanding to Portland for a while now." My father snorted. "In this economy? Restaurants are closing left and right." "Actually," I said, meeting his gaze steadily, "my restaurants are doing very well. So well that I'm in a position to help you both out." I explained my proposal. I would buy the hardware store, keeping the Mitchell name and legacy intact. Dad could still work there as a consultant, sharing his expertise without the stress of running the business. The proceeds from the sale would cover their medical bills and provide a financial cushion. Dad's face reddened. "I don't need charity from my daughter." "It's not charity, Dad. It's a business decision. The store is in a prime location, and it's a solid business with a loyal customer base. I'd be a fool not to invest in it." We argued back and forth, with Mom watching nervously from the sidelines. Finally, I laid my cards on the table. "Look, you always wanted me to go into business, right?" Well, I did. I learned everything about running a successful operation. It just happens to be restaurants instead of hardware. But business is business, and this is a smart investment for me. The fact that it helps my family is a bonus. Appealing to his business sense was the right approach. Dad's expression changed from defensive to considering. "You'd keep the Mitchell name?" he asked. "Of course. It's part of the value of the business." It took 3 more days of negotiations, but eventually, Dad relented. I suspect Mom had a lot to do with his change of heart, as I often heard them talking behind closed doors after I'd gone to bed. Over the next 2 months, I divided my time between Seattle and Portland. I hired managers for the hardware store, updated the inventory system, and freshened up the aging storefront. Dad watched it all with a mixture of resentment and reluctant admiration. Slowly, I could see him acknowledging that I did, in fact, know what I was doing when it came to running a business. The hardware store had been operating the same way for decades. I introduced computerized inventory management, an online ordering system for customers, and expanded the selection to include more eco-friendly products that were popular with younger homeowners. Sales increased by 15% in the first quarter after the changes, which didn't hurt my case with Dad. But the hardware store was just phase 1 of my plan. 2 blocks from Mitchell's Hardware stood Roselli's, an Italian restaurant that had been a fixture in the neighborhood for decades. My father had lunch there every Friday for as long as I could remember. It was his favorite place, where he celebrated every business milestone, where he took Mom for their anniversary each year. Roselli's was old-school Italian, red checkered tablecloths, candles in Chianti bottles, and portions big enough to feed a small family. The walls were covered with photographs of local sports teams and community events that Mr. Roselli had sponsored over the years. My parents' wedding picture hung near the entrance, alongside dozens of other neighborhood couples who had celebrated special occasions there. And it was for sale. The owner, Mr. Roselli, was in his 70s and ready to retire. His children had moved away and pursued other careers. When I approached him about buying the restaurant, he seemed relieved. "I've been worried about what would happen to this place," he told me as we sat in a booth after closing time. "It's been my life's work." Mr. Roselli had opened the restaurant in 1972 with recipes from his grandmother. He knew every regular customer by name and often sat with them during slow periods, sharing stories about the old country. The food was nothing revolutionary, classic Italian-American comfort dishes, but everything was made with care and consistency. The marinara sauce still simmered for 6 hours, just as it had for nearly 50 years. "I understand completely," I said, thinking of Wildflower. "I promise to honor the spirit of what you've built here." The sale went through quietly. I decided not to tell my parents immediately, especially not my father. Instead, I spent a month working with Mr. Roselli, learning his recipes and getting to know his staff. I made subtle improvements to the systems and updated some equipment, but kept the menu and ambiance that regulars loved intact. Maria, the head waitress who had worked there for 30 years, was skeptical of me at first. Mr. Roselli says you own fancy restaurants in Seattle, she said during my first week. You're not going to turn us into one of those places where the food is all foam and the portions wouldn't satisfy a bird, are you? I assured her that wasn't my plan. By the end of the month, she was teaching me how to make her special tiramisu, a recipe she claimed she'd never shared with anyone outside her family. The grand reopening was scheduled for a Friday, my father's regular lunch day. That morning, I called my parents. I want to take you both to lunch today, I said, to celebrate the hardware store's new chapter. We always go to Roselli's on Fridays, Dad said predictably. Perfect. I'll meet you there at noon. I arrived early, my stomach in knots. The staff, all of whom I'd kept on and who were now in on my secret, gave me encouraging smiles as I checked that everything was perfect. I'd had a new sign made, but it remained covered, waiting for the right moment. At exactly noon, my parents walked through the door. Dad was moving slower than before his heart attack, leaning slightly on Mom's arm. They looked confused when the host greeted them by name and led them to the best table in the house, the corner booth by the window that was usually reserved weeks in advance. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, welcome to our grand reopening, he said with a wink in my direction. Dad frowned. Reopening? What's going on here? Where's Mr. Roselli? That was my cue. I emerged from the kitchen, wearing a chef's coat with my name embroidered on it. Mr. Roselli has retired, I said, approaching their table. I'm the new owner. The look on my father's face was worth every struggle, every doubt, every sleepless night of the past 15 years. His mouth opened and closed several times before he could speak. You bought Roselli's? I did. Don't worry. We're keeping all your favorites on the menu. But I might add a few new specials from time to time. Mom reached for my hand, tears in her eyes. Oh, Hazel, this is wonderful. Dad was still processing, his expression a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't quite read. Pride? Shock? Maybe even a hint of remorse? When did you? He stammered. It turns out I did amount to something after all, Dad, I said quietly. Enough to save your store and buy your favorite restaurant. Imagine that. There was an awkward moment of silence before Mom broke it by asking, So does this mean the lasagna recipe is staying the same? Your father would be devastated if it changed. The tension broke, and I smiled. The lasagna isn't going anywhere. Mr. Roselli made sure I knew exactly how to make it before he left. The lunch that followed was surreal. I joined them after checking on the kitchen, and for the first time in my adult life, my father asked me questions about my work. Real questions that showed genuine interest. He wanted to know about Wildflower, about the challenges of running restaurants in different cities, about my plans for Roselli's. I told him about the James Beard Award nomination I'd received the previous year, about the cookbook that was about to be published, about the apprenticeship program I'd started for underprivileged teens interested in culinary careers. With each accomplishment I shared, I could see something shift in his expression, as if he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time. As we were finishing dessert, tiramisu made from Mr. Roselli's closely guarded recipe that he'd passed on to me, Dad cleared his throat. So, I've been thinking, he said, setting down his fork. Since I'm supposed to take things easier now, maybe I could help out here sometimes, if you need an extra pair of hands. I nearly choked on my espresso. Are you asking for a job at my restaurant, Dad? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Not a job, exactly. Just offering my assistance. I've been eating here for 30 years. I know what people like. I fought to keep my expression neutral. I see. And what position did you have in mind? I don't know. I could greet customers, maybe? Help with inventory? The irony was almost too perfect. My father, who had spent years telling me that restaurants were a dead-end career path, was now asking to work in mine. I could have savored the moment, made him squirm a bit more. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I reached across the table and took his hand, something I hadn't done since I was a little girl. How about we start you as a host a few days a week? You know everyone in the neighborhood and they know you. It would be good for business. Relief flooded his face. I'd like that. Mom was beaming at both of us, tears threatening to spill over. This is what I've always wanted, she said softly. My two stubborn mules finally finding common ground. As we left the restaurant, my father paused under the new sign I'd unveiled. Hazel's at Roselli's, with a Mitchell family restaurant, in smaller letters underneath. You know, he said quietly. I was wrong about you, Hazel. I've been wrong for a long time. Coming from my father, those words were worth more than any culinary award or successful restaurant opening. I had set out to prove him wrong, to show him that I could succeed without his approval. Somewhere along the way, the goal had shifted. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something that could bring our fractured family back together. Thanks, Dad, I said, blinking back unexpected tears. That means a lot. 6 months later, Hazel's at Roselli's was thriving. I split my time between Portland and Seattle, with trusted teams running both operations when I couldn't be there. Dad had become the restaurant's most popular host, charming customers with stories about the neighborhood's history and proudly telling everyone that his daughter was the owner and chef. The hardware store was doing well too, with a younger manager handling day-to-day operations while Dad served as a consultant. He'd found a sweet spot where he could share his expertise without the stress of full responsibility, and his health had improved significantly. My cookbook hit the shelves and exceeded sales projections. The dedication page now read, "To my parents, Nancy and Frank Mitchell, who taught me the value of perseverance and the importance of finding your own path, even when it's not the one they had in mind." On a quiet Sunday evening, after we'd closed for the night, I found Dad sitting at the bar, looking through old photographs Mr. Roselli had left behind. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he asked as I sat beside him. "All those dinners you cooked for us when you were younger, the ones I barely acknowledged." "You were busy," I said, though we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. "I was stubborn," he corrected, "and afraid. My father ran his business exactly one way, and his father before him did the same. I couldn't see that there were other paths to success." He looked up at me, his eyes clearer and more present than I'd seen them in years. "You found your own way, despite me. I'm proud of you, Hazel." I should have said that a long time ago. He pulled out an old, faded photograph from the stack, a picture of me at about 8 years old, standing on a step stool in our kitchen, stirring something in a big pot with intense concentration on my face. "Your mother took this," he said. "I remember that day. You insisted on making spaghetti sauce from scratch because you'd watched some cooking show. It took you hours, and the kitchen was a disaster. But that sauce—" He shook his head, smiling at the memory. "It was better than anything we'd ever had before. I should have seen it then, that you had a gift." I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. All those years of seeking his approval, and now here it was, delivered in this restaurant that represented both his tradition and my innovation. "It's not too late," I finally said. "We're both still here. We can start over." Dad raised his water glass. "To starting over, then. And to proving your old man wrong in the best possible way." I clinked my glass against his. "To family. The business and the real kind." The next day, I called James in Seattle with a new business idea. An upscale hardware store cafe where customers could enjoy great food while waiting for staff to mix their paint or cut custom blinds. "It'll be the best of both worlds," I told him. "A perfect blend of my family's legacy." As we sat there in the quiet restaurant, I realized that success tasted even sweeter than I had imagined. Not because I had proven my father wrong, but because in doing so, I had finally found a way to make things right. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't about getting even. It's about rising so far above the past that it can no longer hold you down. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you can bring the people who doubted you along for the ride.